Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and in today's guide, I'll be taking you through all the new abilities that are added in the Awakening expansion for Dragon Age Origins. This includes mage spells, warrior and rogue talents, class specializations, skills, and I'll also be discussing runes as part of one of the skills. First and foremost, it's important to understand that Awakening is a high-level campaign for Dragon Age Origins, so if when you start Awakening you already know how to build a fairly strong character in Origins, you won't have any trouble with the combat in Awakening, especially because there are a bunch of new abilities and items that can make you feel super powerful even more than in the base game. But the flip side is that if you struggled with your build in Origins, you will likely still have some issues in Awakening, despite the fact that your character's power can get higher than before. You may struggle especially during the first main quest before you get a full party, and possibly for a little bit after that as you try to find upgrades for you and your new companions. If you find yourself in this situation, I highly recommend you watch my combat mechanics guide for Origins, which will be linked in the description in a card, because the best thing you can do to improve your experience with combat is understand how the game works in terms of the stats, abilities, and mechanics. I also have guides for each class in Origins going through all the abilities and specializations and explaining why they're good or bad, so those also may be useful. I don't want to put you off trying Awakening, I just want to caution you that if your Warden from Origins isn't built well, it will be harder to play Awakening since it's a high-level campaign. In that case, instead of importing your existing Warden, you may prefer to create a new character so you can have a good build from the beginning. Yes, there are manuals of focus in Awakening which allow you to respec a character, but you need to buy them so they won't be available from the very beginning. So if your character from Origins isn't that good, either respecialize them with a mod in your post-coronation save in Origins, or make a new character for Awakening. With that out of the way, if you feel fairly confident in your understanding of builds and combat in Origins and just want to learn about what Awakening adds and what's good and bad about these new abilities and skills, then this is the guide to watch. Before we get into it, I'll take a moment to say a special thank you to my members. I appreciate all of you so much. Joining as a member would help out the channel a lot, but of course only do so if you want to and if you can afford it. I am always grateful, even if you just like the video if you enjoyed it, and maybe leave a comment. Back to the guide. Let's start with something that all characters, regardless of class, get access to in Awakening. 3 new skills. These skills are Clarity, Vitality, and Runecrafting. Clarity and Vitality are very simple skills that just add to your character's mana or stamina in the case of Clarity, and health in the case of Vitality. Essentially, these are buffing skills that are nice to have. You can invest in them once your character already has the main skills they're interested in. Each rank of Clarity and Vitality grants plus 25 points, up to 100 total if you max them out at rank 4. So with Clarity at rank 4, that's plus 100 mana or stamina, and with Vitality at rank 4, that's plus 100 health. The health bonus from Vitality in particular is huge because it's harder to get bonuses to Constitution and health on items, whereas you can get a decent amount of mana, stamina, and willpower bonuses. I recommend starting to put points into these skills only after you get all the skills you want on that particular character. So, for example, if I have a melee rogue warden, I want to have combat training and coercion maxed out, combat training so I get access to all the weapon talents and some combat-related bonuses, and coercion for the purpose of persuading and intimidating characters in dialogue. I also want to put 1 point into poison making so my warden can use poisons and grenades. Optionally, I could max stealing on my warden if I for some reason want to go around stealing from NPCs, though usually I don't find that it's worth it. So after I'm done with those necessary skills, every time I get a new skill point, I'll add it to Clarity or Vitality. As a melee rogue mainly doing auto attacks, I wouldn't care about extra stamina, so I'd put points into Vitality for health. This will make my rogue warden a bit tankier, without me needing to look for extra defensive bonuses on items, or have to heal my warden too frequently with poultices or spells. Obviously, the skill you prioritize out of these two will vary based on the class and build of your character. A regular mage will prefer Clarity for more mana to cast spells with, so they don't have to drink that many lyrium potions in fights. But a blood mage will want Vitality, since the larger health pool will similarly allow them to cast more spells before their HP gets too low. A tank usually prefers the health, but may also enjoy a balanced approach of alternating between Clarity and Vitality. This is because the stamina from Clarity will allow the warrior to use tanking abilities like Taunt or disabling abilities like Shield Pummel or Overpower more often, so while the HP from Vitality is nice, you can definitely alternate between the two for the added utility of stamina. I've left Runecrafting for last because this one is a bit more complicated. This is a crafting skill like herbalism and poison making, But it's different in the sense that instead of just basic crafting ingredients, it actually uses novice runes as one of its main ingredients. You can easily buy tons of novice runes from a merchant in the throne room at your headquarters, so you don't have to worry about where to get them from, but the fact that you have to buy runes plus extra ingredients, blank runestones, and etching agents does make runecrafting quite a bit more expensive than the base crafting skills. While it is possible to exploit this skill to make infinite money, I don't recommend it because you know how I feel about exploits. They ruin the fun and challenge of the game. But even without exploiting the system to make a ton of money, you should still be able to afford making a few strong high-tier runes for your weapons and armor. Speaking of, in Awakening you don't just have weapon runes, but also some new rune types that can be added to your character's armor, specifically to chest pieces. Not all chest pieces have rune slots, but the ones that do usually have 3, other than a few exceptions that just have 2. There are 5 basic types of armor runes: Barrier, Immunity, Reservoir, Stout, and Tempest. And there are 4 types of hybrid runes: Amplification, Endurance, Diligence, and Evasion. I'm not going to go into full details about these runes, but I will tell you which are good and which aren't. Starting with the basic runes, Barrier runes grant bonuses to armor, which is great for anyone who gets attacked a lot. Melee characters, especially tanks. The issue with these is that you can't really obtain or craft them for some reason. They weren't properly implemented, so you can only find a few Barrier runes as loot, but that's it. If you want to use those, go ahead and use them on a melee character, but don't sweat it if you don't find Barrier runes. Your armor pieces in Awakening are more than enough for protection, especially when you pair them with good defensive bonuses from abilities. Immunity runes grant bonuses to fire, cold, and electricity resistance from plus 3% each at Novice to plus 25% at the Paragon tier. Personally, I don't bother with these other than if I find a decent tier 1 as loot, and even then not that many enemies deal these elemental damage types. Most enemies just deal physical damage, so in most fights it's better to have a general defensive bonus like extra health, armor, defense, or missile avoidance instead of these more specific elemental resistances. Reservoir runes grant bonuses to willpower from plus 1 at Novice to plus 7 at Paragon. These runes could be useful for builds that use activated abilities a lot, like a two-handed damager, or maybe your warrior is a berserker and you like to use the final blow ability, which uses up all the warrior's stamina to deal massive damage, in which case you want to pump up your stamina as much as possible for that huge hit. If you're an arcane warrior and you're wearing armor instead of robes, the extra willpower would grant you more mana for both casting and sustaining spells, so reservoir runes are fairly useful, though not amazing. I don't recommend crafting them unless you really want to pump up your mana or stamina for a very specific build. Stout runes grant bonuses to Constitution from plus 2 at Novice to plus 14 at Paragon. These are way better than Reservoir runes for the simple reason that they have double the attribute bonuses, and also in general you find less items with bonuses to Constitution and Health than items with Willpower and Mana or Stamina. Plus, it's always good to have a larger health pool, and the physical resistance you get from more Constitution doesn't hurt. Health is obviously the main reason you want to use these, so that you make a character able to take more damage before they need to be healed. The Physres can also help characters who don't have access to the warrior's shield wall or indomitable talents, which make the character immune to stuns and knockdowns, since Physres helps you resist a lot of these physical effects. This would be something like an arcane warrior or a dual wielder warrior or rogue. I don't necessarily recommend spending your money on crafting super high tier stout runes because they're expensive to craft, and it's better for you to spend your money on offensive runes and actual gear upgrades. Tempest runes grant bonuses to missile avoidance from plus 2 at Novice to plus 14 at Paragon. I don't find these useful because in Awakening there's less fights against large groups of archers than in Origins, but you also get bonuses towards missile avoidance from your defense score and have an extra chance to avoid any physical attack, whether ranged or melee, if you have dodge chance from items or abilities. Tanks are hardier than ever with the addition of the Vitality skill, stout runes for even more health, extra bonuses from new abilities, and higher armor scores and stats on items. So tanky characters don't really care about getting hit in terms of just basic damage anymore. If you find these as free loot, you can add them to a melee character's chest piece if you don't have anything better, but don't bother crafting any. The hybrid runes are far more interesting and quite a bit more useful than the basic armor runes. These don't have multiple tiers, just one version. Amplification runes grant plus 5% to all elemental damage types. This would be great for a mage, though only if they wear actual armor instead of robes, but you may be surprised to find out other builds can also make use of this. For example, a warrior with the Spirit Warrior specialization has the Soul Brand talent, which upgrades their Beyond the Veil Sustained to make them only deal spirit damage with their attacks. so you could in fact buff their spirit damage by 15% if you have 3 of these runes, and of course the bonus would be even more useful if you have elemental runes in your weapons to buff other elemental damage your character does as well. Keep in mind that poisons, weapon coatings, and grenades also get their elemental damage buffed by these bonuses, so if you don't have another armor rune you really want, the bonus to elemental damage could be great even for a rogue character using grenades and high-tier poisons or weapon coatings plus elemental weapon runes. Overall, the amplification runes are a great offensive addition to any character who deals a significant amount of elemental damage. Endurance runes grant -5% fatigue, so they can help you reduce the cost of your character's talents or spells by offsetting the fatigue penalty of their armor. This would have been far more useful in Origins because in Awakening you have so many potential bonuses to your character's mana or stamina that fatigue doesn't really matter. Plus 100 from the maxed out Clarity skill, potentially a bunch from Reservoir armor runes, not to mention a bunch of great items with high willpower or mana and stamina bonuses. Because of this, I don't recommend Endurance runes at all. Diligence runes grant flank immunity, meaning that enemies will not get a bonus if they attack your character from behind, and rogue enemies in particular can't backstab your character. This bonus is only useful for a few melee character builds. A weapon and shield character can already get full flank immunity with a shield tactics passive, so they don't need it. A two-handed warrior would appreciate this, especially if they are a tank and will draw a lot of enemy aggression. Same with a dual-wielding warrior, though generally dual-wielders aren't used as tanks per se, but can still benefit from flank immunity. I wouldn't waste an armor rune slot on your rogues or arcane warriors for this, because as long as you have a proper tank who keeps enemies away from the other party members, you don't need to worry about your non-tanks being attacked from a flanking position or otherwise. If you don't feel super confident that your tank can keep enemies off of everyone else consistently, I'd recommend trying to improve your tank's build first. But if you still want the extra safety, then sure, Diligence runes are technically useful for anyone who gets into melee fights. Finally, Evasion runes grant plus 5% dodge chance, and these are by far my favorite hybrid armor runes. Dodge chance is super useful since it adds a whole separate chance for your character to avoid getting hit by melee or ranged attacks on top of your existing chance to avoid them through your defense and missile avoidance stats. If you've seen me rank items from Origins or even just recommend items in my build guides, you know that dodge chance items are amazing, especially for melee characters. So I definitely recommend adding such runes to all your melee characters. Even better if you can get items with dodge chance to increase the bonus further. The maximum dodge chance is 100%, and you can in fact reach it, especially if you imported a character from Origins who had a bunch of items with dodge chance in their inventory. Bottom line is, if you find this as loot, use it, and if you're interested in crafting runes, then these I do recommend. In order to craft an Evasion rune, you need a Master Lightning rune, a Master Tempest rune, a Blank Runestone, and 4 etching agents. You can buy Blank Runestones and etching agents from Sarah in the throne room. If you import a Warden from Origins, you may be able to import your character with some Master Lightning runes in their inventory, or of course you could craft some or potentially find some in Awakening. For the Master Tempest rune, you'll either have to craft one, find one, or buy one. Very likely you will have to craft it. But the Master Lightning rune is easier to obtain, especially if you just import a character who has a few of those. Anyway, these have been the armor runes. Most of them are pretty mediocre, but there are a few that are good, and of course the evasion runes that are amazing due to dodge chance being so powerful. But just use whatever you can find, frankly. Especially if you're playing on easy or normal, you shouldn't have trouble at all with the game, even if you completely ignore armor runes or just use the ones you find as loot. Moving on to weapon runes. These ones also got a facelift, meaning that all the existing weapon runes from Origins got the new Masterpiece and Paragon tiers, but there are also a few new hybrid weapon runes specific to Awakening: Elemental, Intensifying, Menacing, and Momentum. Just like with the armor runes, the hybrid weapon runes don't have multiple tiers and instead just have one bonus. Elemental runes grant +2 damage from each element, that is fire, cold, electricity, spirit, and nature. Unfortunately, while this rune sounds cool on paper, you're just getting a tiny amount of damage from each element, and as you may already know from my Origins guides and rankings, some of these elements are pretty much useless. A bunch of enemies are completely immune to nature damage, such as all undead. Undead are also highly resistant to cold damage, and some creatures like revenants are completely immune. Fire is one of the best elements because Darkspawn and Undead are weak to it, but in that case, just use fire runes. Electricity is pretty good because no enemy is immune to it and few enemies are resistant. Spirit is the same as electricity in Origins, but unfortunately in Awakening I will say that some enemies, the Darkspawn Disciples for example, are quite resistant to spirit damage, so it's not as great, at least in fights against Disciples. This elemental rune was built to be used as a jack of all trades in case you don't want to switch between elements or creature-specific runes and just want something that will deal extra damage to all the enemies you meet, even if that damage is not super significant. But the unfortunate truth is that we already have that with lightning runes because enemy resistances and immunities in Origins and Awakening weren't designed in a balanced enough way, so lightning is just usable everywhere. So yeah, if it's not clear already, I don't recommend using elemental runes. Intensifying runes grant plus 5% ranged and melee crit chance, and plus 20% crit or backstab damage. This is perfect for physical damagers, whether melee or ranged. In particular, I'd give this to melee and ranged rogues, and damager two-handed warriors. Dual-wielder warriors don't really have high crit chance in general, plus not great options for auto-crit abilities. Dual-wielding rogues don't have the same problem because they have the backstabs, which act as critical strikes, plus a higher crit chance from various passive bonuses. Either way, this is a great weapon rune to add one or two of in your damager's weapons, alongside some high-tier elemental damage runes, or silverite runes specifically against Darkspawn since they are the main enemy in Awakening. Menacing runes grant the increased hostility bonus, which adds 5 points of threat to each of the character's attacks. I don't necessarily see the point in using this on a tank because you should already be drawing enough enemy aggression with the threat and sustain and using the taunt talent often. It's a perfectly fine utility option for a tank for a bit of extra threat generation, but it's not necessary and I certainly never bother with it. Finally, momentum runes grant 5% increased attack speed. If you already have a mage casting haste in the party, you don't need this. Dual-wielding characters also easily increase their attack speed with the momentum sustained ability. Haste increases attack speed by about 33% for the entire party, and momentum increases it by 43% for the dual wielder, whereas this rune only increases it by 5%. This rune is a waste of space, and you'd be way better off just using a damage rune instead, because a 5% attack speed bonus just isn't strong enough to take up a rune slot when you can get really high tier damaging runes, even if just Grandmaster ones, because those actually feel significant. So as a little conclusion to the runecrafting skill and the new runes in Awakening, runecrafting is a nice skill to use if you enjoy crafting bonuses for yourself and focusing super hard on minute power increases. Runes have never been necessary in Dragon Age Origins, and they don't magically become necessary in Awakening either, especially at lower difficulties, but you don't need them on Hard or Nightmare either if you know how to play the game. Runecrafting is essentially a money sink for the player, since there aren't as many new equipable items to buy, and you may already have great pieces of gear from Origins if you imported your character. So it makes sense that the devs added something to do with your money, though other than for min-maxing or money exploiting purposes, it's kind of useless. Don't get me wrong, I really like some of the runes, but whenever I play Awakening, I end up crafting a few runes in the beginning, and then pretty much forget to craft any more later on because I don't need them. If you do want to experiment with rune crafting, I recommend maxing it out on your least favorite companion and just putting them in your party while you're at Vigil's Keep, your headquarters, so that they can craft runes for you. You don't need rune crafting on multiple characters, so just get actually useful skills for combat and exploration on the party members you like to use. Moving on to the new abilities added to each class in Awakening. I'll talk about the weapon style skills first because those are half shared between rogues and warriors. Rogues just have dual wielding and archery, whereas warriors have the weapon and shield, and two-handed trees on top of that. Each weapon tree gets 4 new talents. For weapon and shield, the new talents are Juggernaut, Carapace, Air of Insolence, and Bulwark of the Ages. Juggernaut is a sustained talent that allows the warrior to knock down any enemies who are in the way while their character is moving. Each knockback drains 10 points of stamina, regardless of fatigue. It's possible to hit the same target more than once in quick succession, which is a waste of your stamina. Normal enemies are knocked down, elites can only be knocked back, and bosses are completely immune. This talent is also an exclusive sustained together with Shield Wall, Shield Cover, and Shield Defense, meaning that you can only have one of these active at a time. In truth, this talent is kind of useless because normal enemies are a joke, and you don't really care about knocking elites back. Plus, the Shield Wall sustained is far better for your warrior since the upgraded version makes them immune to stuns and knockdowns, so the only reason you'd want to unlock this is to get access to the other talents in the row. Carapace is an activated talent that lasts 20 seconds and reduces all damage the warrior takes based on the warrior's Constitution attribute. For example, if you have 30 Constitution, all damage taken is reduced by 15. With the fact that we have stout runes which add extra constitution plus possible con bonuses from items, this can be a really effective talent to use when your warrior is getting hit either by a lot of enemies, by one enemy dealing a lot of damage, or if your warrior is getting damaged over time by an enemy spell or ability, since it reduces each instance of damage. This makes Constitution a good substitute for armor, since with high Constitution, just about any attack could be reduced to 0 damage. But keep in mind, this is only while this talent is active, which is for 20 seconds, after which you have a 1-minute cooldown. So obviously, it's still important to have high armor scores from your gear. But this provides you with some nice added tankiness, so I do recommend picking it up for a weapon and shield tank. Air of Insolence is a sustained talent that increases the warrior's threat towards all enemies in the area around the warrior with a purple shockwave effect every 3 seconds. While the talent says it drains stamina, there isn't any stamina regen penalty, nor any stamina consumed for each shockwave, so you can 100% use this without having to worry about running out of stamina. The talent will automatically get deactivated if your character runs out of stamina for a different reason though, so do keep that in mind. This is obviously a great addition for a weapon and shield tank build, since it adds even more threat generation on top of the threat and sustained and the taunt talent. Bulwark of the Ages is a passive that upgrades the Carapace talent, making the warrior completely immune to damage for the first 10 seconds of the Carapace effect, and also making them immune to the Overwhelm ability in those first 10 seconds. A great upgrade for a tank for the damage immunity. The immunity to Overwhelm is nice, but the issue is that Carapace has a long cooldown, and so if you're fighting multiple enemies with Overwhelm, after those first 10 seconds of Carapace, you'll still be vulnerable to Overwhelm. So just get this for the damage immunity and don't worry about Overwhelm. For dual wielding, the 4 new talents are Twin Strikes, Find Vitals, Low Blow, and Unending Flurry. Twin Strikes causes 2 automatic critical hits, which is very nice since dual-wielding characters didn't have very good auto-crit abilities in the base game. But other than for its use as an auto-crit, it's not amazing. If you have the Find Vitals passive, each of these also inflicts bleeding damage equal to 66% of the initial damage, which is applied over 5 seconds, which is a decent chunk of extra damage. Speaking of, Find Vitals is a passive that grants plus 10% melee crit chance and plus 20% critical damage while the character is dual-wielding. It also upgrades Twin Strikes to gain that extra bleeding damage over time. This is an amazing talent for any dual-wielder who cares about doing critical hits, like rogues or even warriors focusing on crit chance and crit damage. Obviously, rogues have more bonuses towards crit chance and can also make the use of extra critical damage with their backstabs, but the addition of this passive makes more crit-focused dual-wielding builds for warriors more viable than in Origins. Low Blow is an AoE attack that hits enemies in a small sphere around the character. 5 hits of 90-degree arcs are made in quick succession, and it is possible to hit moving enemies multiple times, but also not at all. A successful hit grants penalties of attack and movement speed of the target by 30% for 5 seconds. As an extra possible effect, if the target is affected by the bleeding damage from Twin Strikes, if you hit them with Low Blow, the enemy will slip and fall on the ground without a check to resist this. This is a great AoE ability for a melee character, though dual wielders already have the amazing dual weapon sweep and the very similar Whirlwind. The bonus to this is that slow effect on enemies and the possible slip for an enemy affected by Twin Strikes. I'd essentially use this instead of Whirlwind, but Dual Weapon Sweep is still a great and cheap AoE talent to continue to use alongside it. Unending Flurry is a sustained talent that allows your character to stab an enemy repeatedly until the character either misses an attack or runs out of stamina. Each successful hit drains 20 stamina regardless of fatigue. It attacks about 3 times per second, even faster than dual-wielding daggers. It's ideal to use for quickly killing a single dangerous enemy, like a spellcaster or a powerful elite. This talent is unique in the way it works because while it's sustained, it requires a hostile target to activate and only affects that one target. This is most similar to the grab attack of the Ogre because both combatants are locked in close combat and neither can make any other action until this ability ends. Successful hits can be critical, but they don't apply rune damage or any weapon enchantment spell, so this is a situation where you want to have weapons with a high base damage amount as well as bonuses to direct damage instead of extra elemental damage. I only recommend using this against very specific high priority targets that you want to get rid of quickly, like I mentioned, spellcasters and elites, or even potentially a boss if you think you can deal a lot of damage to them in this way. But don't bother using it against normal enemies since you can easily kill them with just auto attacks or cheap talents. For two-handed weapons, the new talents are Sweeping Strike, Two-Handed Impact, Onslaught, and Reaving Storm. Sweeping Strike is an AoE damaging ability that strikes enemies in a cone in front of the warrior, very similar to the dual-wielding dual-weapon sweep talent. However, this one is even better because it inflicts a critical strike on the primary target, aka the target you are currently attacking, while dealing just normal damage to the other enemies in the cone. It also can't miss, which is great. Every enemy in the cone will take damage, so it's a very safe talent to use regardless of enemy defenses. Sweeping Strike also knocks targets down to the ground, and only bosses are allowed a resistance check. Obviously, enemies that are immune to knockdowns will resist it, but it's still a great ability because otherwise two-handed warriors lack AoE options. The only thing you have to remember when you use this ability is that in the vanilla game, it's auto-targeted. So if you already have a target selected that your warrior is attacking, the ability will automatically be aimed with them in the center, and you won't be able to freely aim the cone. If you want to aim the cone yourself, you'll have to first move your character a bit to deselect the enemy, or choose a different enemy first and afterwards use Sweeping Strike. However, if you have the Dane's Fixes mod, then there is a bug fix which allows you to aim the cone of Sweeping Strike even if you already had a target selected, which is very much appreciated. Two-Handed Impact is a sustained talent that applies an explosive on-hit effect to the equipped weapon, meaning that the weapon creates a shockwave within a 2-meter radius around a target whenever it is hit with a basic attack. Enemies within that range take some physical damage based on the attacker's strength. However, this sustained has a huge -20 stamina regeneration, and frankly, it doesn't do that much damage to be worth using. I don't believe you can reach a +20 bonus to stamina regen, so personally I don't recommend it. Just use an AoE talent instead, like Sweeping Strike or Two-Handed Sweep. Onslaught is an active talent that causes the character to move forward while doing sweeping strikes in front of them, possibly hitting multiple enemies. The attacks have a normal chance of being critical hits, but otherwise this ability doesn't have extra effects. It's a decent enough AoE damaging ability, though Sweeping Strike is better because it guarantees a crit against a main target. But it's certainly good to have if you have the extra ability points and don't have something better to use them on. Reaving Storm is a sustained talent that causes the character to enter a frenzied mode in which they continuously attack all enemies around them. The hits can be critical, and each successful hit drains 10 stamina. This immobilizes the user and disables your ability to use other talents. To exit the mode before the end of combat, you'll have to deactivate Reaving Storm manually. This plus the limited range of two-handed weapons makes this talent very situational because you can only attack enemies within a melee range. However, this does make your character immune to the Overwhelm ability of the Childers, which is a very high damage ability, so if you're fighting Childers, you may want to turn this on if a lot of them are attacking your two-handed warrior, at least until you thin out the herd a little. Finally, for Archery, the new talents are Accuracy, Arrow Time, Burst Shot, and Rain of Arrows. Accuracy is a sustained talent that grants the archer bonuses to attack and damage equal to their dexterity -10, and bonuses to ranged crit chance and ranged crit damage equal to their dexterity -10 times 0.5%. The ranged crit chance bonus provided by Accuracy can be doubled by aim if you activate aim after Accuracy. This obviously only works with a bow equipped, so you can't use it to boost melee attacks, but for an archer these are great bonuses to get. A nice extra sustain for the archer to use to increase their damage and crits alongside aim. Arrow Time is another sustained talent that reduces the movement speed of enemies by 20% within a certain range of the archer while this is active. This mode has a huge stamina regen penalty of -10 though, and while the effect is neat, I don't think this is worth using unless you're doing something funky like a solo archer build. It's essentially a reference to bullet time in movies or other games where time slows down while the character is focusing on aiming or attacking or dodging. But other than for a super niche build, it's not useful due to the huge stamina regen penalty. Burst Shot is an activated talent that shoots a special arrow, scoring a triple critical hit against a target, which then shatters, inflicting half the damage of that initial hit on the enemies within a 3-meter radius from the primary target. Friendly fire is possible, so do be careful with this. Despite the description, this attack doesn't seem to actually have this triple crit hit implemented, so in effect all enemies in the area take about 150% critical damage. Plus, the attack isn't actually a critical hit either if you wanted to use it for the purpose of shattering frozen or petrified enemies. Still, it's a good AoE damaging ability, since the only other AoE talent archers have is Scattershot, which is more so used for the stun effect and only sometimes for the damage. I wouldn't use this against one single priority target, you have Critical Shot and Arrow of Slaying for that, but instead I'd use this if there's a fairly large group of enemies grouped together, especially in the beginning of a fight when none of your melee characters are next to them. Rain of Arrows is an activated talent that shoots multiple arrows that rain down over time in a targeted area, which is a 7.5 meter circle. It deals 10 instances of damage over 10 seconds. Do be careful because these arrows will come down upon you. You shoot them straight up into the sky, so if you want to avoid getting hit, move your archer away from that area. The archer would only take half damage, but it's still annoying since you'd rather have enemies be hit by these shots. The damage isn't amazing. For example, if you have 40 dexterity, each shot would just do 39 damage. It's a fairly expensive talent to use as well since it costs 80 stamina and has a 1-minute cooldown. So personally, I wouldn't use it on a regular archer at all, since you already have everything you need with the auto crit abilities, now with the extra burst shot, plus the large bonuses to damage from the accuracy and aim sustains. The new weapon style abilities are good, though there are a few subpar talents in here too. I personally really like the idea behind Unending Flurry and Reaving Storm because they work mechanically very differently from any other abilities we have had access to in Origins. So even if they're not necessarily amazing, I give them points for innovation. Moving on to the class abilities, Warriors and Rogues get 4 talents each, whereas Mages get 8 new spells and passives. As always, Mages get more overall abilities than the martial classes, but almost half of those are useless, so it kind of evens out. The new warrior talents are Second Wind, Peon's Plight, Grievous Insult, and Massacre. Second Wind is an activated talent that restores 80% of the warrior's maximum stamina when used. It has a long 2-minute cooldown, so in most fights you're likely to only use this once. But it's still a great talent to refresh your stamina, especially if your warrior is the type to use a lot of activated abilities. Peon's Plight is an activated talent that causes the warrior to strike an enemy with a powerful blow. A successful attack automatically kills a target of normal or lower rank, inflicts a double crit against an elite, and a regular crit against a boss. This only works with melee weapons, and unfortunately it's far less useful than it seems. Normal rank enemies are extremely easy to kill already. This deals less damage to elites than most of the new Awakening talents, and even a few old ones. It doesn't even have an added effect like a stun or knockdown, yet it still costs a substantial amount of stamina. And using it against a boss serves as an additional auto crit, but at the cost of more stamina than Mighty Blow and Critical Strike, so in essence this is useless, and you'd only want to unlock it so you have access to the next 2 talents. Grievous Insult is an activated talent that draws the aggression of all enemies within 10 meters by increasing the warrior's threat, but it also physically pulls them towards the warrior, knocking them down in a process similar to the mass pull ability of Revenants. This is a really cool talent, especially for tanks, but also for damager warriors who want to bring enemies closer to them to be able to use various AoE abilities to kill them faster. It has a 1-minute cooldown, so it's best used towards the beginning of the fight when there's still a significant amount of enemies on the field. In essence, it's even better than a taunt due to the fact that it's not only stronger for threat generation, but it also pulls the enemies towards you. Massacre is an activated talent that makes the warrior do a spin attack, which is supposed to do massive damage to enemies around them. This will obviously only work with a melee weapon, and despite being intended to kill lower rank enemies similarly to Peon's Plight, it doesn't necessarily do that. It just deals area of effect damage that is approximately a double critical shot. Due to this, warriors with two-handed weapons and high strength tend to get the most out of it, as well as dual-wielding warriors who are using intensifying runes to increase their crit damage. While the description suggests a whirlwind-like attack, this ability is visually identical to Warcry, meaning that the character is standing while unleashing a battle shout. I imagine that it was supposed to look like a whirlwind, but someone implemented the wrong animation, and they didn't realize until it was too late. This is useful specifically for those high-damaging two-handed characters or high-crit damage dual-wielders, but otherwise you don't need it. So if you have a weapon and shield warrior or a more defensive character, don't bother using this because it costs a huge 100 stamina to activate. The new warrior talents aren't bad, but other than the nice stamina refresh from Second Wind and Grievous Insult for tanks, I can't say the other two are amazing. They can be alright for damage if you're a high damage warrior, but if you already have high damage and crit damage, your other cheaper talents are just as good. The new rogue talents are Heartseeker, Ghost, Weak Points, and Flicker. Heartseeker is an activated talent that strikes one enemy and deals spirit damage instead of physical. targets with less than 250 total HP will take damage equal to their max HP, which can kill them, but doesn't necessarily if they have high spirit resistance. Enemies with higher amounts of health will just take normal critical damage, but it's still spirit, so that can be nice if they don't have a high resistance to it. This only works with a melee weapon. It's a decent ability to use to try to kill a high priority target that is squishy, like a normal or elite spellcaster, and an elite rogue like an assassin of sorts. They should have fairly low max health, so should take that huge amount of spirit damage, but otherwise don't bother using this on regular enemies since they're already easy to kill, and I wouldn't use this on bosses since they have high health and it'll just be a regular crit on them. If your crit damage bonus is high, that could be decent, and if you want to deal extra damage to a target, you can also pair this with a hex that reduces the enemy's elemental resistances like vulnerability or affliction hex. But use this sparingly because it does cost 80 mana. Ghost is an activated talent that grants the rogue a 100% dodge chance for the next 15 seconds. This means any attack that requires an attack roll to succeed will not hit the rogue, so this is pretty good. However, it's not necessary. You likely already have high defense as a rogue, you shouldn't be getting attacked much since your party's tank should keep enemies off you, and you may also already have a fairly high dodge chance from gear and other bonuses. 15 seconds of being immune to physical attacks isn't as useful for a squishy rogue as it is for a tanky character, like the new weapon and shield talent Carapace that I talked about earlier. This is an alright emergency button to have, but don't feel like it's a must-have. I can see this used in a solo playthrough, but in a regular playthrough you'll be just fine without it as long as you have a tank. Weak Points is a sustained talent that applies an on-hit effect to the rogue's equipped weapons, either ranged or melee, which increases all the damage taken by a target hit by that weapon by 5% for the next 5 seconds. 5% extra damage taken from the party isn't really significant enough on a single target, especially when the assassin already has the Mark of Death talent, which marks the enemy to take 20% more damage from all sources for the next 20 seconds. In contrast, Weak Points doesn't stack with itself, the bonus is so low and it only lasts 5 seconds. The best scenario you can use it in is if you use an AoE talent that hits multiple enemies and is able to apply on hit effects like Dual Weapon Sweep, Whirlwind, and Scattershot. But that's it, otherwise you just regularly attacking a single enemy for an extra 5% damage is not good. Personally, I never use this because you can already deal such large amounts of damage in Awakening that this 5% bonus isn't significant enough to waste your stamina for. Flicker is an activated talent that causes the rogue to kind of teleport from their current location to each enemy within a 7.5 meter sphere, one after another, backstabbing each enemy once and appearing behind the next target immediately after. BioWare used this kind of rogue ability in the later games as well, in DA2 and Inquisition, and personally I don't like the visual effect of a rogue teleporting around like that because it feels too magic-like. Sure, you can imagine that the rogue is actually just quickly ducking and weaving between enemies while hitting them where it hurts, and the visual effect is a teleport since it would be super hard to animate their movement between enemies when those targets can be arranged in lots of different ways in the area. Anyway, this is a strong ability to use against a larger group of enemies, particularly if you have a high bonus to your crit or backstab damage, since all the hits from Flicker are backstabs. This is a fairly high cost ability, 80 stamina, so only use it against a large enough group. It's a fine AoE ability to have if your backstab damage is high, but I wouldn't rush for it. I recommend unlocking the actually strong abilities for your build, the weapon style talents and the specialization abilities, plus some of the basic rogue talents, and only after that, if you still have the extra points you don't know what to do with, you can pick this up. The new rogue talents are the weakest of the bunch in my opinion. None of them feel like must-haves for any build. They can be good in certain builds, but they're so situational that they're hard to recommend. The new Mage Abilities are arranged into 2 rows of 4. The first one contains 2 passives, 1 sustained and 1 active spell, Fade Shield, Elemental Mastery, Attunement, and Time Spiral. The second row contains 4 sustained spells, Repulsion Field, Invigorate, Arcane Field, and Mystical Negation. Fade Shield is a passive that grants the mage plus 5% spell resistance and dodge chance. This also upgrades the Arcane Shield spell, adding 15% dodge chance and spell resistance while Arcane Shield is active, on top of the usual defense bonuses. This passive is mostly useful for an Arcane Warrior or a mage who likes to be fairly close to enemies with short-range spells, because it gives you great defensive stats. I love using this on an Arcane Warrior who has a lot of sustained abilities active to buff themselves and the party. A regular mage who stays at range and shoots spells from afar doesn't really need this, since they shouldn't get attacked, but it is a prerequisite for the other abilities in this tree, so I do recommend picking it up in general after you're mostly done with your main build. Elemental Mastery is a sustained spell that grants the mage plus 15% to all elemental damage types. It does have a fairly high cost to sustain, 100 mana in reserve plus 10% fatigue, but for a mage damager, this is an amazing sustain that will increase their damage. This is of course even more useful if you have a somewhat mixed element build, where you are using spells of various elements to have more versatility against different enemy types. In Origins, the elemental damage bonus cap is plus 30%, but in Awakening it goes up to plus 50%, meaning that you can either use this sustained or try to find better gear with elemental damage bonuses to improve your damage output, in addition to the usual increasing magic and spell power. Due to this being fairly expensive to sustain, it's best to have a high mana pool from bonuses to willpower and mana or stamina, especially from gear, but you may know from my mage builds that I do recommend putting some points into willpower when you level up anyway. So this is nice, not strictly necessary, but could be a very significant damage upgrade. Attunement is a passive that grants the mage amazing offensive and utility bonuses, plus 10 magic, plus 10 willpower, and plus 2 combat mana regeneration. This is absolutely a must-have for any mage. Magic increases your spell power and thus the damage and effectiveness of all of your spells. More willpower means more mana to cast spells with, and the mana regen is great to be able to keep certain spells sustained, which may have a mana regen penalty, like Haste or the Arcane Warrior's Shimmering Shield. But even if you aren't using any of those sustained spells, extra mana regen is always great to recover your mana faster and maybe have to use less Lyrium potions in a fight. Time Spiral is an activated spell that has a unique effect. It resets all the cooldowns of your spells, not including itself, of course. It has a 2-minute cooldown, so this is generally something you'll only use once or maybe twice in a fight, but it can be very powerful if used at the right time. It can save you if a defensive spell like Group Heal, Revive, or Force Field isn't available, but it can also allow you to cast some very powerful offensive spells a second time on the same enemy or on multiple enemies in quick succession. Things like Curse of Mortality, Petrify, Crushing Prison, the huge AoE spells Blizzard, Inferno, and Tempest. Mana Clash is another cool one to use on 2 enemy spellcasters at the start of a fight. I love this spell because it genuinely does something different than just give you an additional buff or source of damage. This is useful for pretty much any mage build that uses active spells, especially high value, high cooldown ones. Even an Arcane Warrior could benefit from this if they have certain good spells they cast with their weapons drawn. From the second row, Repulsion Field is a sustained spell that creates a field around the mage that pulses every 4 seconds, knocking enemies within the field back unless they pass a physical resistance check. Mana is consumed every time an enemy is successfully knocked back. This is an exclusive sustained spell out of Repulsion Field, Arcane Field, and Mystical Negation. You can only have one of these 3 active. This sounds useful on paper to try to keep enemies away from your mage, but in practice it just has a chance to knock enemies back for a second, after which they will continue to run towards you, and the next pulse comes 4 seconds later, so it doesn't really protect you well enough. I don't recommend it. Invigorate is another sustained spell that is supposed to grant the mage a bonus of minus 20% fatigue, while also imposing a huge penalty of minus 10 mana regen in both combat and exploration. The issue is that the fatigue bonus doesn't even work, because the spell itself has a fatigue penalty of 20% from keeping it sustained, which means you get no fatigue bonus while incurring a huge mana regen penalty. So this spell is an absolute waste. Arcane Field is a sustained spell that creates a field around the mage that pulses every 4 seconds, dealing spirit damage to all enemies within the field. The damage scales with spell power, and each time an enemy is hit, it takes away 15 mana from the mage, unaffected by fatigue. This is the second exclusive field spell together with Repulsion Field and Mystical Negation, out of which you can only have 1 active at a time. This could potentially be a decent sustain for an Arcane Warrior, because they like to go into the fray and thus tend to be surrounded by enemies, and have a good reason to keep this up. But while it's decent for an Arcane Warrior, I can't really recommend unlocking this because it requires wasting 2 points for the previous 2 spells, which suck. If you really have nothing better to do with your ability points, then sure, you can get this, but usually you should have other better things to use your points on. Mystical Negation is the final sustained spell which creates a field around the mage which pulses every few seconds, probably 4, and dispels any magical effects within the field that were created by a hostile creature. This is the last exclusive field spell together with Arcane Field and Repulsion Field, meaning you can only have one out of these active at a time. While this is potentially useful, there are other ways to dispel enemy effects that tend to be a lot easier. You can use Force Field on yourself or on another ally to keep them safe from the damage and lack of ability to heal, of Curse of Mortality, and you could even pick up an actual Dispel Magic spell if you really feel like you need it. I have never needed to use this field spell ever, and unless you're doing some kind of weird challenge or perhaps a solo playthrough of Awakening, I can't imagine this is worth unlocking all the previous 3 spells for. The new Mage Abilities are a mixed bag. The first row is nice, but the second row is mostly useless other than maybe Arcane Field for an Arcane Warrior. The upside is that the Mage was already great in Origins and didn't really need extra spells to feel good, plus you do get the unique feeling Time Spiral for the cooldown resets, which allows you to do more fun stuff in combat. Moving on to the new specializations. Awakening adds 6 in total, 2 for each class. The Mage gets Battle Mage and Keeper, the Rogue has Legionnaire Scout and Shadow, and the Warrior gets my favorite specializations from Awakening, Guardian and Spirit Warrior. The Spirit Warrior is my favorite overall because it kind of makes you unkillable, looks really cool, and has a nice thematic flavor, but we'll talk about it in more detail when we get to the Warrior specializations. Starting with the Mage specializations, the first one is Battle Mage. This is a nice companion specialization to Arcane Warrior because Battle Mages prefer to be close to enemies. Unlocking this specialization grants the Mage +2 magic and plus 0.25 combat health regen. The health regen is barely there and you won't feel it, but the bonus to magic is very nice because it increases your spell power. But of course, unlock bonuses don't matter that much. The main thing you care about are the abilities. You get 4 abilities as part of this specialization, 2 sustained spells, 1 activated spell, and a passive. Draining Aura is a sustained spell that creates a field around the mage that deals spirit damage to all enemies within and also heals the mage for some of the damage. The damage effect happens every 4 seconds, and every time an enemy is damaged, it costs 30 mana, unaffected by fatigue. This is an extremely powerful spell for Arcane Warriors because they can heal themselves and of course damage enemies and draw threat at the same time. You can only have either Draining Aura or Elemental Chaos active at a time, and if you are a Blood Mage with Blood Magic active, this will still drain mana, not health. A regular mage could also use this, but obviously they'd have to be fairly close to enemies for this to be worth using, and they'll have to deal with the threat generation by using various spells to cause disabling effects on enemies. Hand of Winter creates a burst of cold damage in a 7.5 meter radius around the mage, damaging enemies but also having a chance to freeze them if they fail the resistance check. The damage scales with spell power, and the base freeze duration is a huge 10 seconds, adjusted by enemy rank, but still good, though bosses can't be frozen. Enemies can be shattered if frozen by this spell. This is honestly an amazing spell for any mage because it can protect them from enemies deciding to attack them by damaging the enemies and freezing them, and granting the possibility of shattering enemies with critical strikes or Stone Fist. But of course an Arcane Warrior will really like this, especially when combined with a sustained field spell that damages enemies around them, since you can freeze enemies in place and then keep damaging them with your aura effects. The best part is that you can cast the spell with your weapons drawn too, so it really is perfect for an Arcane Warrior. Stoic is a passive that causes 50% of the damage taken by the mage to be converted into mana. Health lost to blood magic spellcasting also triggers this effect, but obviously when you are using blood magic, your mana is likely high unless you used mana first, then cast blood magic. Do keep in mind that if your defensive stats are super high and enemies don't deal much damage to you, you'll obviously get very small amounts of mana from this passive. Personally, I don't think it's a problem, as this passive is just nice to have for an Arcane Warrior to get some extra mana back, but you can always just use Lyrium Potions, so you don't need to nerf your defenses just to try to get more mana from Stoic. Elemental Chaos is a sustained spell that creates a field around the mage that damages enemies every 2 seconds with a random type of elemental damage. This spell also has a huge mana regen penalty of -20 in both exploration and combat. You can only have 1 out of Elemental Chaos and Draining Aura active at a time. You can't really keep this sustained forever unless you're getting a ton of mana from Stoic and possibly things like Death Siphon. Plus, while the damage is higher because it occurs more often, every 2 seconds instead of every 4 with Draining Aura, the damage type is random, and you could end up doing a shitty or utterly useless damage type that the enemies you're fighting are highly resistant or immune to. So because of the huge mana regen penalty and the random elemental damage, I don't recommend using this. Draining Aura is just better. Overall, the Battle Mage works super well combined with Arcane Warrior, especially in the tank kind of build that I prefer to play and which I recommend for people. Sustaining Draining Aura will give the Battle Mage Arcane Warrior enough AoE damage to easily attract the aggression of all nearby enemies, while Combat Magic and Shimmering Shield are great for defensive bonuses. Remember that if you also use Rock Armor, Arcane Shield, and possibly Miasma, you'll replenish less mana because the mana gain from Stoic is equal to 50% of damage taken, though I prefer taking less damage from enemies and just using Lyrium Potions if I run out of mana, but having Death Siphon would also be nice for mana regeneration. Just turn it on every once in a while or keep it sustained to absorb mana from enemy corpses. The second Mage Specialization is Keeper. I don't personally use this other than on Vallana, but I can tell you what each Keeper ability is good for. The unlock bonuses are +2 magic and +3 mental resistance. The magic is of course useful for the extra spell power, and the mental res is pretty much useless. Of course, you also get access to 4 abilities. 1 sustained, 1 passive, and 2 activated spells. One with Nature is a sustain that immobilizes the mage while this is active, but also deals nature damage every 2 seconds and inflicts a penalty of 40% movement speed to any enemy within a 5-meter radius. The mage is also immune to knockdown and slip effects while this is active, since they are immobilized. Unlike other field spells, this one doesn't cost mana whenever it deals damage, nor does it reduce mana regen. But the issue with this one is that you deal nature damage to nearby enemies, and you already know from my many mentions of this that nature damage sucks, because many enemies are resistant or immune to it, undead in particular being the largest group of creatures that are immune. Yes, this is nature damage because you're one with nature, but at the same time you could have just as well dealt physical damage with rocks and vines, like the other 2 Keeper spells do, which would have been far more useful in more situations. As it stands, it's fine against enemies that don't have immunity or high nature resistance, and you could combine it with Miasma for extra attack, defense, and movement speed penalties to nearby enemies, but do keep in mind that you will be drawing a significant amount of enemy aggression, so you should have defenses in place, or ways to very quickly kill the enemies who are coming to attack you. If you're an Arcane Warrior, you could use Shimmering Shield, or even just a Combat Magic sustain plus things like Arcane Shield and Rock Armor, and then get yourself in the middle of an enemy group to cast One with Nature and other area of effect spells like Arcane Field or the Battle Mage's Draining Aura to deal a bunch of elemental damage to nearby enemies. Plus, you'll be able to use the next Keeper spell, which is much better than One with Nature, but which requires you to have the sustained active. You can also use this sustained as a more classic mage, but then you likely wouldn't have that many enemies in the area around you to damage with it, so I mostly recommend this for someone who likes to go and fight in melee. Thorn Blades is an activated spell that you can cast while you are using One with Nature to call roots from the ground that deal physical damage to all enemies within the field created by One with Nature. This spell is much better than just using One with Nature because it deals physical damage instead of one particular element, so it will damage all enemies fairly well, especially because the damage scales with your spell power quite nicely. On top of that, physical damage from Thorn Blades isn't mitigated by armor at all, so even enemies that have high armor won't be able to do anything against this large amount of damage. Enemies will also be knocked back quite far unless they pass a physical resistance check. Overall, this is the only reason I ever personally use One with Nature, for the huge armor ignoring physical damage of Thorn Blades. Replenishment is a passive that causes the mage to be healed by 20% of the damage they inflict through spells, though it seems this only applies to damage dealt by One with Nature. Also, when an enemy dies within the field of One with Nature, the corpse is consumed, giving the mage a +20 health regen bonus for 6 seconds, meaning a total of +60 HP recovered. This passive would have been great if the healing actually applied to all the damaging spells you cast, not just One with Nature. As it stands, it's literally only useful if you plan on using One with Nature very often, and if you're fighting enemies that can actually be damaged enough with nature damage. It's fine, but I wouldn't necessarily pick it up unless you really want the final ability. Nature's Vengeance is an activated spell that summons gigantic roots from the ground to attack all enemies in a 10-meter radius around the mage, dealing huge amounts of physical damage to the enemies and also impaling them for 5 seconds unless they pass a physical resistance check. This physical damage once again can't be mitigated by enemy armor, so it's great for the purpose of bypassing enemies with relatively high armor scores, though most enemies don't have very much armor to begin with. In any case, this is genuinely a huge AoE damage spell if you're fighting a large enemy group, since even just the base damage without any extra spell power is already 150, and there's basically no way for enemies to reduce it. Another great spell, but it is fairly expensive, 100 mana before factoring in fatigue, plus the cooldown is a whole minute, so you'll likely only use this once or twice in a fight. Possibly a third time if you have Time Spiral and reset its cooldown to use it again, but you'll have to have the mana to cast it. Overall, the Keeper is a bit strange because the 2 AoE physical damage spells are amazing, but then you also have One with Nature, which for some reason deals nature damage, which is essentially poison. If One with Nature had just slowed enemies and dealt some small amount of physical damage, or imposed some other penalties while making the mage tankier, I think it would have felt a lot nicer to use, and also made more sense that at least one of the Keeper's spells is something where they use nature as protection, not just to attack enemies. Anyway, this is a nice enough specialization. Most of the time, I just don't bother picking it up for my Warden because I prefer to play other types of builds. Moving on to the Rogue Specializations, the first one is the Legionnaire Scout. This is a truly unique specialization for the Rogue because it's focused on making the Rogue tankier, of course based on the kind of hardiness that members of the Legion of the Dead need to have in order to survive for a long time as they fight Darkspawn in the Deep Roads. The unlock bonuses are +2 dexterity and +1 damage per hit. These are great for any kind of rogue build, so even if you're not necessarily playing a rogue that wants to be tanky, as long as you don't have another specialization that you really care about picking up, this is a great third specialization for anyone due to dexterity and extra damage always being useful for rogues. But of course, you're also getting access to 4 abilities, 2 passives, 1 sustained, and 1 activated talent. Mark of the Legion is a passive that grants a huge bonus of +10 strength and +10 constitution. The strength will increase your attack score and physical resistance, but it could also increase your damage if you aren't using the lethality passive, or if your rogue's strength is higher than their cunning, in case you're doing more of a hybrid build for them using medium armor and such. The Constitution obviously grants +50 HP and also extra physical resistance, so your rogue will be able to take more damage before needing to heal, but they will also be more likely to resist physical effects like stuns, knockdowns, slips, and so on. Strength of Stone is an activated talent that grants immunity to damage for 15 seconds, and all physical resistance checks always succeed. It can also be upgraded by Blessing of the Ancestors to add immunity to both hostile and friendly spells for the duration, but that may be more of a nerf than a buff if you have a mage in the party that casts a lot of beneficial spells on your party members like healing, buffs to attack or defense, and of course weapon enchantments. The rogue baseline already has a similar effect that allows them to avoid a lot of damage for 15 seconds, the new talent Ghost, which grants 100% dodge chance. Still, Strength of Stone will also make you immune to any damage from spells, which is nice, and on top of that, due to the immunity to damage, it also completely negates the Overwhelm ability, which makes this in truth far more useful than Ghost, since Darkspawn Childers can use Overwhelm, so with this you can at least avoid the usually unavoidable ability for 15 seconds. Activating Strength of Stone will deactivate the Endure Hardship sustained. Speaking of, Endure Hardship is a sustained talent that depletes the rogue's stamina instead of their health whenever they're supposed to take damage. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure that this sustained is worth using. I certainly don't bother with it, because as a Legionnaire Scout, you're already tankier due to the extra health from the passive, you're already likely to have high defenses to avoid enemy attacks, and so it's not really that big of a deal if every once in a while an attack or spell does go through and damages you. You're not going to die from one enemy ability, especially if you have a mage in the party who can intervene if something like a grab or overwhelm happens. So personally, I don't recommend using this unless you're doing some weird challenge playthrough, in which case you very likely already know how to use this best, so there's no real point in listening to my general recommendations. Finally, Blessing of the Ancestors is a passive that upgrades Strength of Stone, providing immunity to both hostile and friendly spells for the 15-second duration of that talent. In fact, you will be immune to hostile and friendly spells, talents, and grenades. But again, this isn't a good upgrade if you have a mage who often heals your allies and casts other beneficial party-wide buffs, like weapon enchantments, haste, and such. This will also make you not get bonuses from something like Song of Valor or Song of Courage from a bard party member. If you're not using a mage in the party, or if your mage is solely or at least mostly focused on damage, then yes, you could pick this up to ensure that you are safer against dangerous enemy spellcasters for a short time until you manage to disable or kill them. But for general party compositions where you likely do have beneficial party-wide buffs from various characters, I recommend skipping this passive. I really like the Legionnaire Scout for the first two abilities, the passive granting huge bonuses to strength and constitution, and the talent that makes you immune to damage and be able to succeed all physical resistance checks. I recommend skipping the final two since they don't really offer something that useful unless you're playing in a very different way than the more usual builds and party compositions. The Shadow Specialization is the second one the rogue gets, and this one is more focused on dealing damage to enemies while being stealthier. This specialization is most useful for a melee rogue that focuses a lot on auto attacks and backstabs specifically. The unlock bonus is +1 dexterity and +5 attack, which is a pretty good bonus for a rogue since it makes your attacks more likely to succeed, and dex is always solid. Let's talk about the 4 abilities the Shadow gets: 1 passive, 1 sustained, and 2 active talents. Shadow Form is a sustained that makes the rogue go in and out of stealth, reducing the threat enemies have towards the shadow by 5 every time an enemy hits the shadow. This mode does have a huge -10 stamina regeneration penalty though, so it's hard to keep it sustained for a long time unless you have gear with stamina regen, plus bonuses from other sources that can get you close to or at +10 stamina regen to negate the penalty. If you also have the Shadow Striking passive, Shadow Form is upgraded to also grant the rogue a +50% bonus to backstab damage. The really cool part of this upgraded version is that this backstab damage bonus is a special type of bonus, which is separate from the regular bonuses to crit or backstab damage. So with the Shadow Striking upgrade, you get your total backstab damage multiplied by 1.5 after all the previous bonuses from plus crit or backstab damage apply, so it's a huge buff. An amazing choice for a backstab-focused rogue damager. The Flicker talent would also be nice to use in combination with the upgraded Shadow Form, since it does a lot of backstabs in quick successions to enemies in an area, and all those backstabs will deal huge damage. Decoy is an activated talent that creates a decoy of the rogue to keep enemies occupied for 10 seconds while the actual rogue escapes into stealth. You can fail getting into stealth if there are enemies of too high rank for your rogue's rank, as per the usual stealth rules. However, if your rogue doesn't have the stealth skill at all, you can get a special version of stealth from the decoy talent that will always succeed regardless of the ranks of nearby enemies, and it will also not reduce your movement speed. It's also not broken by using abilities or by attacking or by enemy perception. The downsides of this particular stealth effect are that it doesn't guarantee critical hits for your basic attacks, and it only lasts for 10 seconds like the decoy. Personally, I really like this decoy-specific stealth because it allows your rogue to get away from dangerous enemies if need be, and I frankly don't bother with regular stealth for combat anyway, so it's a win-win situation. You'll have to try using this for yourself if you're interested, because regular stealth has the advantage of an automatic crit on your first attack, but it breaks stealth, whereas the decoy-specific stealth can be more useful for the purpose of staying safe from enemy attacks for 10 seconds. Shadow Striking is a passive that grants the rogue a permanent +5% melee crit chance bonus. It also upgrades the Shadow Form sustained, granting +50% backstab damage while Shadow Form is active. As I already said when discussing Shadow Form, this is a huge buff because it multiplies your total backstab damage by 1.5 after all the other bonuses are factored in. Pandemonium is an activated talent that releases a toxin in a 5-meter radius around the rogue, which causes a confusion effect on all enemies in the area, causing them to either flee or attack a random target. The base duration is 10 seconds, but is adjusted by enemy rank, so it could take less time. This is a fairly costly ability for 80 stamina that, in all honesty, doesn't do enough to be worth using. It would be much better to use something like Decoy if you feel like you're in danger and want to get out, or else get one of your other party members to cast some kind of disabling spells on the enemies bothering you. Enemies generally don't deal that much damage, so them attacking each other will not do very much for you. It's much better to use an offensive talent in which you yourself deal damage to enemies, because that will deal a lot more damage. So I recommend skipping Pandemonium and just picking up the first 3 Shadow abilities. On the whole, Shadow is a very strong specialization for melee rogues, but unfortunately only for melee rogues, which is a bit of a problem. Archers already have slim pickings when it comes to specializations that help them out, because Assassin and Duelist were already melee focused, and now Shadow is added to the list as well. It's a shame, but at least the archery talents are nice, accuracy in particular, so it's not all bad for archers. And other than the Bard specialization, which can increase your rogues and party stats with one of the sustained songs, you can choose whichever other 2 specialization give you the best unlock bonuses for archers. which would be Duelist and Legionnaire. Both grant dexterity and damage bonuses, plus some bonuses and abilities that can be useful to archers. Last but not least, the Warrior Specializations, starting with Guardian. This one is meant for tanks, with abilities that help you protect your other party members. The unlock bonuses are +1 Constitution and +5% Nature Resistance, which are very small, but obviously due to the nature of the specialization, the abilities matter far more than the bonus you get when choosing it. Guardian's Shield is an activated talent that designates a particular ally to be protected, creating a shield around them that lessens the damage the ally takes by an amount based on the Guardian's Constitution score, more specifically 30% of the result of Constitution -10. With Master Guardian, this gets upgraded to 50% of the result of Constitution -10. The shield lasts for 30 seconds. This is a really nice shield to give to a melee damager ally who may get targeted by enemies due to dealing a large amount of damage, such as a two-handed warrior or a dual-wielding rogue. It's not a must-have ability by any means, but it is useful if you're trying to get your tank to provide as much protection for their allies as possible. And it would certainly be very much welcome if you're playing with a party that is lacking a mage, since you won't get various buffs or healing from magic, and so any kind of damage mitigation is helpful to keep you from burning through your health poultices. Fortifying Presence is an activated talent that applies a buff to the party, granting between 5 and 15 armor for 10 to 30 seconds, depending on the Guardian's constitution. However, the armor granted by this decays over time, so the party doesn't get the full amount for the entire duration. The ability does stack with itself, but the existing stacks keep their original duration, but you can keep using it to get extra armor because it has a super short cooldown of 10 seconds. Or if for some ungodly reason you have two Guardians in the party, they can both keep using it to grant a bunch of armor bonuses to the party. I don't find this a super useful talent, since tanky characters tend to have high armor scores already, and rogues have high defense and possibly dodge chance, so they avoid enemy attacks entirely and thus don't need the extra armor. In some situations where your characters are hit by an unavoidable attack like grab or overwhelm, then yes, this would reduce the damage that character takes by some extent. But other protective abilities are better in that case, like Force Field or the previous ability I just discussed, Guardian's Shield. If you have Master Guardian, it's much easier to get the max armor buff and duration, since you'll only need 37 Constitution for that, whereas with a base talent, you would need a whopping 91 Constitution. So yeah, if you plan on using this, absolutely upgrade it with Master Guardian. Speaking of, Master Guardian upgrades Guardian's Shield to provide more damage mitigation to the chosen ally, 50% of the result of the Guardian's Constitution -10 instead of 30%, and it also upgrades Fortifying Presence to have much lower Constitution requirements to reach the +15 armor buff and the 30-second max duration. It's a very nice upgrade, very useful even if you're only using Guardian's Shield to get more damage mitigation. Aura of the Stalwart Defender is a sustained talent that creates a 5-meter field around the warrior, which pulls and knocks down enemies near the edge of the area towards the Guardian, but only if either the Guardian or enemies are moving. It doesn't work on bosses and can only be activated during combat. And the worst part is that this sustain reduces the warrior's movement speed by 80%, and it has a huge stamina regen penalty of -20. So frankly, the only way I recommend using this is to use it for just a few seconds to get one pull and knockdown effect, then immediately turn it off. Otherwise, your tank will be far too severely impacted by the penalties, they won't be able to do much, and all of their other sustained abilities will be deactivated if this drains all their stamina. Personally, I don't use it at all, and I recommend skipping it, but the disabling effects could be useful as a sort of emergency button to just use for a few seconds at a time, so you could unlock it if you think that would be helpful to have for how you prefer to play. The Guardian is a nice specialization for a tank, though it doesn't do anything for threat generation. Instead, it's just focused on protecting an ally with Guardian's Shield, buffing the party's armor with Fortifying Presence, and potentially pulling enemies away from attacking other party members with Aura of the Stalwart Defender, but only sparingly. Personally, I use this specialization very rarely when playing Awakening because I'd much rather have Spirit Warrior together with the basic Origin specializations like Champion, Reaver, or Templar, but I may be biased because I just think the Spirit Warrior is such a cool concept. Spirit Warrior is the second warrior specialization, and it's focused on making the warrior into a half-ethereal entity, augmenting their physical attributes with spirit abilities from the Fade. This is a mage-like specialization for the warrior that I think is super well done because it finds a way to feel distinct from a mage by using the look and feel of spirits from the Fade specifically. It's really interesting how we can have both the Arcane Warrior specialization for the mage and the Spirit Warrior for the warrior, and yet these two feel like completely different types of character builds because they are so well built thematically. Anyway, I'll stop gushing about this to say that the unlock bonuses for Spirit Warrior aren't great by any means, just +1 Constitution and +5 Physical Resistance. As a tanky character, you don't really need the extra physical resistance, and the Constitution is just +5 health, which you barely feel. Still, the abilities are far more important. Beyond the Veil is a sustain that turns the warrior half ethereal, granting them a huge +50% dodge chance, as well as immunity to knockdown, stun, and slip effects. This ability does have a large -10 stamina regeneration penalty though, so you'll have to try to get enough bonuses to stamina regen if you want to offset this penalty and be able to keep it sustained for a long time. If you have Soul Brand, this gets upgraded to also grant +20% spell resistance and cause all of your attacks to deal spirit damage instead of physical damage while Beyond the Veil is active. And with Blessing of the Fade, it's upgraded even further to grant bonuses of +20% movement speed, +20% melee attack speed, and another +25% spell resistance. If you're a warrior tank, this is the best defensive sustain you can get, but it does come at the huge cost of that stamina regeneration penalty, which you need to offset so that you don't accidentally drain all of your stamina and lose all of your other sustained abilities. However, in Awakening there is also the option of just chugging stamina potions whenever your stamina gets low, so if you can't fully offset the penalty, just activate Beyond the Veil at the start of a fight, drink stamina potions whenever your stamina gets low, and just remember to deactivate Beyond the Veil once combat is done. It would be much easier to be able to keep it sustained forever, but it requires a lot of bonuses to stamina regen, which you may not be able to give your warrior in case you also need such bonuses for another character in the party. There are also a few things to talk about in regards to the spirit damage, but I'll discuss them as part of Soul Brand. Soul Brand is a passive that grants permanent bonuses of +5% spirit damage and +5% spell resistance to the warrior. It also upgrades Beyond the Veil to grant +20% spell resistance and turn all of the warrior's physical attacks into spirit damage attacks to bypass enemy armor entirely. While spirit damage does bypass armor, do note that some enemies, mostly Darkspawn disciples, are highly resistant to spirit damage, and your warrior's damage would be decreased on them if you have Beyond the Veil active. However, if you combine your spirit damage attacks with a mage's hexes that lower enemy resistances, like Vulnerability Hex and Affliction Hex, then this spirit resistance of the disciples stops being a problem. And otherwise in general, very few enemies are resistant to spirit damage, so it's a very safe damage type to use. I will also mention that most enemies don't have super high armor though, so bypassing their armor isn't really that big of a deal. The main purpose of upgrading Beyond the Veil would be for the extra spell resistance. If you want to make the most out of the spirit damage attacks, you'll have to get some more bonuses to spirit damage, and as I already said, combine these special attacks with mage hexes to make enemies more vulnerable towards spirit damage. You do already get a total of +15% to spirit damage if you unlock Soul Brand, Fade Burst, and Blessing of the Fade, so you'd only need another 35% to get to the max bonus. Fade Burst is an activated talent that causes an explosion of spirit damage in a 7.5 meter radius field around the warrior, dealing half of the normal damage to the Warden and normal amount to companions in the area, including the Spirit Warrior using it. So do keep in mind you are also damaging yourself with this talent. The warrior also gets a permanent +5% spirit damage bonus when unlocking this. The more interesting thing is that this deals double damage to spirits, demons, and undead, so it's particularly useful if you are fighting a group of such creatures and want to deal a large amount of damage to them quickly. Fade Burst is a fairly costly talent, 80 stamina, and the damage scales with your character's willpower, which generally will tend to not be super high, so I don't recommend using this unless you're specifically fighting spirits, demons, or undead, because they take double damage. Otherwise, a regular AoE weapon talent is preferable because it won't damage you or your party members. Blessing of the Fade is a passive that grants a permanent +5% spirit damage bonus and also upgrades Beyond the Veil with +20% movement speed, +20% melee attack speed, and +25% spell resistance while it's active. This is a great defensive and offensive buff for your warrior, and definitely worth unlocking fairly early if you're focused on the Spirit Warrior aspect of your build and using Beyond the Veil a lot. The Spirit Warrior specialization is my favorite mainly due to the vibes, though it can also be strong due to the defensive bonuses you get from Beyond the Veil, especially the dodge chance. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this specialization for a purely damage-focused warrior, though you could do some interesting things with the Reaver, Berserker, and Spirit Warrior. Overall, all the specializations added in Awakening are interesting enough and thankfully powerful enough to be worth using in various situations. The Mage, I think, gets the best ones in terms of power, since Battle Mage enhances Arcane Warrior so well, and Keeper can work with any Mage build at the very least for those physical damage AoE spells. The Rogue, I feel, lacks a little in the range department, since both specializations help melee rogues, but I guess they didn't quite know what specialization they could make that would focus on ranged combat. But in any case, I find that these additions make Awakening feel like a fairly fresh experience, since you get to experiment with all of these new abilities. The problem that Awakening has is that it's too easy due to being a high-level campaign. At level 18 to 20, you're already so powerful that it's very hard to create something that feels like a challenge in combat, other than a couple of boss fights. For that reason, I've only finished Awakening 3 times, and have a bunch of half-finished playthroughs of it, because the gameplay gets to feel quite boring after you've tried all the new stuff out due to being too easy. You only have the story to follow, and while there's interesting things going on, Awakening is only an expansion, not a full game, so the characters aren't fleshed out enough, the companions don't have enough interactions and character development, the story is fairly short and doesn't feel epic enough, and so on. Still, I do like Awakening, and I play at least a little bit of it every now and then, so I hope you're not put off trying it for yourself based on my experience with it after so many years of playing through it. It's a great little addition that expands upon details about the Darkspawn that were left unexplored in Origins, and it for sure feels nice to play through all of the post-Origins DLC with your Warden to add a little bow on top of your heroic adventure from Origins, in particular Awakening and Witch Hunt. I didn't like Golems of Amgarak, but that's another discussion. Anyway, I hope you found this guide about all the new abilities in the Awakening expansion for Dragon Age Origins interesting and useful. If you enjoyed this, I hope you stick around for future guides and other videos I plan to make about both Awakening as well as other games I care about. I'm currently planning some build guides for the Awakening companions, but lots more is coming up. Feel free to leave a like, comment, subscribe, or maybe become a channel member. Everything helps. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.